feel for who's in the room today? Can you put your hands up if you're a developer? Look at all of you, that's amazing. Who's a tester here? Any testers in the room? Somebody hissed when I asked that yesterday. I can see a couple of hands going up hesitantly. Don't worry, you're safe with me. Any managers here? Scrum masters, agile coaches, consultants like me? Fantastic. So I wanted to talk about leadership. This concept of leadership at every level has come from Kanban. And what I wanted to do, when I normally give this talk, I'm frequently talking to people in the lean space, in the agile coaching space, people who have a leadership role anyway. But I wanted to give you, developers particularly, some hints and tips for how you can develop leadership yourselves. So when we think of leaders, we often think of people kind of standing up at the front and everybody listening to them, people managing teams. If you look at Forbes have this brilliant list of things that leaders have. They talk about courage, they talk about honesty, integrity, ability to communicate well. I think somebody should go talk to the people in the US about that. But there's one thing that every leader in the world has in common. They all have followers. Who's on Twitter? Who's got followers on Twitter? That's surprisingly few of you. Very surprisingly few of you. Most of my followers are on Twitter. I've got about close to 12,000 of them, which is overwhelming to me. But you only need a few people following you to be able to have that influence, to be able to change things for people. Okay. So a group that's really, really great at doing this leadership at every level are the armed forces, particularly the Marines. They talk about how every Marine is trained to act instinctively for themselves, and they know what the mission is. They know what it is they're trying to achieve. There's a guy called Stephen Bungay who's been writing about this. He's got a great book called Art of Action. Well worth a read, even if you only just get through the first couple of chapters. And in this book, he talks about what happens both in the armed forces and in business. He says people have this intent that they're trying to meet, this mission that they're trying to carry out. And what you do is you set up some plans that you think will lead to the intent, and people will carry out actions from those plans, and from the actions you get a particular outcome, which may or may not match your intent, but it sets the context for the next level of plans that you set out to get. There's a problem. We as human beings, we can't get hold of all the information we want. We can't follow everything exactly the way people want us to because we can't read people's minds. And so we get this alignment gap where the actions don't quite match the plans. And then the outcomes might not be the ones that we want to get from the actions. We're not sure what the outcomes are, you know. We've got a knowledge gap where we don't know whether that alignment has been made, what the new context is. And so we try and close these gaps. We people don't like having these gaps. And we do this very instinctively, and particularly managers do this very instinctively. And this is more common in business than in the military. We close the alignment gap by issuing more instructions to people. So we want them to carry out particular actions, so we issue very, very detailed instructions. And then as the actions get carried out, we want to make sure that the outcomes that result from the actions are the ones we want, so we put tons of controls in place. And then we have this knowledge gap, so we want to know what our new context is, so we're going to have lots and lots of status reports. And before you know it, you've got all these teams running around, following very detailed instructions while trying to stay within the governance and compliance and talking to CAB while issuing lots and lots of red-green status reports. Right? Does this seem familiar to anyone? Who's on a waterfall project here? A couple of people. Who's on an agile project here? Fantastic, that's really good to see. Who's on a project that's calling itself agile? That's more common, that's way more common. Okay, so this is Hermann von Moltke, the elder. He's got a nephew called the younger who wasn't as cool as he was. And he's got this lovely quote, which you're actually all familiar with. I'll translate it for you. It says, no operation reaches with any certainty beyond the first contact with the enemy's main force. And we know that in English as plans never survive first contact with the enemy. Right? This is the guy who coined that quote. This gives us a problem. We don't have enemies in business, but we do have risk, we have uncertainty, we have competitors. And when we put things into the marketplace, we make discoveries. We'd love everything to be predictable. We do not like uncertainty at all. They did an experiment in University College London where they had this little game. And in this game, they put snakes under rocks. And the volunteers who were participating in this experiment, they had to turn over the snakes, turn over the rocks, and look to see if there was a snake underneath. And if there was a snake underneath the rock, they got an electric shock. I don't know who volunteers for these games. I hope they were well paid. And the object of the game was to learn to predict the snake population so that you could avoid the rocks with the snakes underneath. So the people who experienced the most stress, they measured the stress, the adrenaline, the sweat of the people playing this game. The people who experienced the most stress were the ones who had a 50% chance of having a snake under a rock. Not the ones who weren't getting shocked as much, they were cool, but not the ones who were getting shocked a lot either. They kind of got resigned to it or something. And it turns out that loads and loads of experiments have proved we would rather have a bad, certain outcome than uncertainty. Those people who were in this experiment who were experiencing that 50%, they were also the best at solving the problem. They had the highest incentive to do so. Okay. Predictability sells. This is from the Scrum Guide. It says, you know, the point of Scrum is to optimize predictability and control risk. Anyone involved in scaled agile framework transformations? A couple of you, I'm so sorry. They routinely and predictably deliver value, so routine predictability. And I question whether that's actually what we need, whether that's actually what we want. Dave Snowden wrote an article called A Leader's Framework for Decision Making. And in this article, he introduced a thing called the Kanban framework. Put your hands up if you've come across Kanban. Only a few of you. Fantastic. The rest of you are going to have a magic time. Those of you who have heard Kanban, I love it when people who've heard of this before actually go out and share it and teach it with others. So please consider doing that, especially if you've heard me speak about this before. Okay. So he introduced this thing called the Kanban framework, and it's a framework which basically says, in your context, software development, you probably aren't going to have any predictability, or not much predictability. You can't have the predictability that you want, or that you expect. So he says most business is carried out with this assumption that there's this predictability in order, and it doesn't exist. Before I introduce the Kanban framework, I want to just show you a different model that will help you to understand it. And this is something you're all familiar with. We call it the innovation cycle. So who here remembers the very early camera phones? Very early ones, right? Most of you are probably thinking Nokia. Actually, Kyocera and Sharp made the very, very first ones. And they did it, they made it horizontal, so a landscape mode. And they had the camera pointed towards the user because they thought people would use it for making video calls. And it turned out that the internet didn't quite support it, the bandwidth wasn't big enough back then, and most people actually wanted it for taking photos. But it was a differentiator for them. They sold a large number of phones. And then Nokia came along, very famously, they spoiled the differentiators. They saw that and they said, oh, we could do that too. But we're going to push on the back because we've worked out now that people want to take photos. Do anyone remember what was next to the camera on the phone? There was a flash, but anything else? It had a little mirror so you could take selfies. Nokia invented the selfie. Thanks for that, Nokia. Hands up if you've got a camera on your phone. Keep your hands up if you've got two, one on the front and one on the back. Right? That's how commoditized these have become. And when something has become highly commoditized, you can build on it. And you get things like Pokemon Go and all the virtual reality apps. And we've seen this cycle so many times with so many different technologies. Probably in the future, virtual reality will have libraries, things that we can use, so we can just knock up these applications and get it working, and it will be really, really easy. And everybody will be wandering around like this instead of like this. Right? Okay, so we're all familiar with this innovation cycle. We've all seen this before. The reason I introduce this is because the dynamics in Cynefin are as important as the domains. The borders of Cynefin are fuzzy. The borders of the domains are fuzzy. Things do move around. And you've all seen this before, so this is one of the main dynamics. Let me introduce Cynefin. The hardest thing about Cynefin is pronouncing it because it's a Welsh word. So I would like you all to say the name Kevin to me, like Kevin Costner. Say Kevin. Kevin. Brilliant. Put an N in it. Say Cynefin. Superb. Okay, fantastic. It's really simple framework. It's very easy to understand on the surface. There's a bit of a rabbit hole. If anybody wants to come down and talk to me afterwards, I can start you on that journey. But just understanding it's pretty easy. So the first domain we tend to encounter is the obvious domain. And obvious problems are either ones which children can solve, or if they do require expertise, the solution's still obvious. So I go to the landlady in the pub, I go, what do you do if the beer runs out? And she says, well, I change the barrels, obviously, duh. Right? And I think of these as duh problems. We can categorize the problem. We can say, oh, it's one of those problems. Yeah, I've seen it before, really easy. As things become more and more complicated, they require expertise. So a watchmaker knows how to fix a watch. A car mechanic knows how to fix a car. The outcome of these things is really, it's still predictable. A lot of mechanical stuff ends up in this domain. And you can analyse the problem. You can say, okay, I can see where I'm trying to get to. I can see where I am. Let's close that gap. So a mechanic can look at the car and analyse what's wrong with the car. You can look at your code and go, I'm expecting this outcome, and so I can close that gap. Okay. The problem is down here in the chaotic domain. Chaos is accident and emergency. It is your house burning down. It is a transient domain. It resolves itself really quickly, and it might not resolve itself in your favour. And we don't like this. This is why we don't like uncertainty. It is also the domain of urgent opportunity, but it's normally regarded as a bad place to be. In chaos, you have to act, and to act quickly. At the end of 2012, there was a company called Knight Capital Group. They released something to production on 8 of their 9 servers and forgot to release it to the 9th. They reused a flag which turned on some software that shouldn't have been on that 9th server, should have been replaced. That 9th server started putting spurious trades into the marketplace when they turned it on Monday morning. 45 minutes later, they finally found the problem and switched it off. In that 45 minutes, they lost something like $13 billion. And the big banks and investment houses have this agreement that if something is obviously a mistake, they'll wind it back because they know that one day it will be them. But the small hedge funds kept the money. When they tallied everything up, it was 440 million, and that company no longer exists as a result. 45 minutes for a large organisation to fail. That's chaos. That's why we don't like chaos. And because of that, we have this reaction to uncertainty. This gives us a problem. The complex domain is one in which cause and effect can only be correlated in retrospect. So they can be correlated, obviously, here with expertise up in the complicated domain, not at all in chaos. You've got to be out of chaos to make sense of anything. But in the complex domain, you can see with hindsight how you got somewhere, but you couldn't possibly have predicted it. So there was a company called Ludicor had this big online game called Game Never Ending, and they wanted to get more people to come play the game. So they said, what we'll do, we'll set up a site where people can share screenshots of the game and everybody will see how pretty the game is. Players sharing all these lovely screenshots will get more players. That'd be awesome. So they set up this site and people started putting screenshots in the game. And then the dot-com crash happened. This was back in the early 2000s. And they had to make a decision on what to do with this half-finished game. It wasn't in a position to make them any money. And so they said, what can we do with the tools we've got? We've got this screenshot sharing site. People weren't just sharing screenshots, they were sharing other photos photos of their families and kittens, and that became Flickr. And with hindsight, you could see how it's happened, but you couldn't possibly predict it. They tried to get the game working again more recently. Apparently it has a very loyal following. And this time they got the admin tools for the admin's messaging service working behind the scenes of the game. And again, something happened. 2008, we had the financial crisis, and they had to do something with this unfinished software. Those messaging tools became Slack. And Stuart Butterfield, who's the CEO of both those organisations, said, if you want to replicate my success, don't try and create a failed MMO. That's not how it works. You can see with hindsight how it happened. You get these emergent outcomes. The trick with complexity is to try things out which are safe to fail, and we call that probe. So it's trying things out. Those of you who are on Agile projects, you're used to this. You're used to showing people your software, and as you show it to people, they go, oh, that's not quite right. Can you do this? Can you do this? Can you tweak this? And so the outcome emerges over time. In the obvious domain, you have best practice. So anybody talking about best practice, this is a place that it exists. In the complicated domain, you have good practice. In the chaotic domain, you have novel practice because you've got nothing to lose. The complex domain is one where the practices emerge as well as the outcomes. So different teams will have different things that work for them, and that's okay. In the middle is disorder. Disorder is the domain where we do not know which of these dominates, so we behave according to our preferred domain. Put your hand up if you've ever been asked for an estimate in time or money for something you've never ever done before. Keep your hand up if you were a fool like me and you actually gave one. And keep your hand up if that got treated as a commitment or a promise. Oh, look, all the hands go back up, right? Because we've all been there. We've all been in this place where we were handling uncertainty and we made a guess at something and somebody went, okay, I'll go and do this other thing then, and now it's concreted in place and it's turned into a commitment. We never intended for that to happen. So that's a Kanban framework, really simple. I've got this little scale that I use. Oh, actually, before that, I wanted to show you this. My friend Sally Ann Freudenberg has a degree in psychology. She's a psychologist, and I was chatting to her about some of the things in my head, and she says that I apparently have a little bit of autism, and autistic people have very, very visual ways of thinking. So I've got a very visual ways of thinking. She said it's also very common in the developer community. So I thought maybe some of you would really appreciate this. There's nothing wrong with it, by the way. This is how it appears in my head. So in the obvious domain, everything's blocky and moves really easily. And in the complicated domain, everything's cogs and it's all slightly greasy and metallic. In the chaotic domain, everything's on fire. And the complex domain, I always see as something very organic. And it's got lots of plants and stuff. And I frequently use elephants because I really like elephants. Okay, so that's what it looks like. And now you'll be able to remember it really easily. Okay, so I use this scale to help people work out where on that scale they are. So I ask, who in the world's ever done this before? 5. Nobody's in the world's ever done it before. It might not work at all. The Kanban framework, incidentally, is not just focused on software. It's actually from sociology and anthropology. So an example of non-software, never done it before, is trying to land someone on Mars. And they're actually doing experiments with that in Antarctica, where they can fly people in and out, and they can fly resources in and out, so it's a little bit more safe to fail. 4, somebody outside the organisation's done it before, so probably one of our competitors. So we're trying to spoil somebody's differentiator. It's still complex. We still don't know what they discovered. We don't know how long it took them. We don't know what's held them up or what expertise they had that enabled it to work. So we're still going to be in a high discovery space. 3, somebody in the organisation has done it before. Or we have access to expertise in a different way. We can learn it from books, learn it from YouTube. 2, someone in the team's done it before. And 1, we all know how to do it. Now, I showed this to somebody who was developing a target operating model for a government. And he looked at it and he said, oh, so the 5s and 4s, that's where the risk is. I said, yeah, absolutely. Those are the high discovery areas. That's where you're going to discover stuff. You're going to learn. And I said, But that's where the value is too. I said, absolutely. Because you're always doing something new. If you were only providing the capabilities to the business that you already had provided, there would be no value in it. The value is always, always in something new. If you want to know where it is, ask, what are we going to be able to do with this that we couldn't do before? What's our staff, what's our customers, what's our other systems going to be able to do that they couldn't do before? And you'll find those 5s and 4s. Every single project, every change to a product, every organisational transformation is driven by trying to provide new capabilities, either new system capabilities or new organisational capabilities. It's always about the new stuff. He said, so we should do those first, those 5s and 4s. I said, yeah, absolutely, while you've still got time to react. And he said, but the whole industry does it the other way round. I said, yeah, they do. Because people like predictability and they think they can have it. So they analyse everything that can be analysed, do all the easy stuff first, hoping the rest will drop out later. Devs, you have the power to lead this. A probe in software, a thing you're trying out, is called a spike or a prototype. And whenever you're coming across something new, you'll know because the analysis will fail. You'll be in those 3-hour analysis paralysis thrashing sessions. Anyone been in those? Right? You can propose, put your hand up. So, are we having trouble here because it's new? Because I could put out a spike, I could do a prototype, and maybe that would help inform us as to what to do next. That's the first simplest thing you can do to start leading people to embrace that uncertainty and get that value out. This is roughly how they fall on the Kanban diagram. 3s, incidentally, are a brilliant place to do BDD. I'm a massive BDD fan. I was involved in the early coding of JBehave. If you're into BDD, you need to have known outcomes to do BDD. If you try and do it down in the 2s and 1s, people get really, really bored. It's enough just to name the scenarios and be done with it. The one where we create a user, the one where we delete a user, the one where we update a user. The 5s and 4s, you'll probably find as you start talking through, there'll be some uncertain outcomes. When you have enough to progress, go for it. Get that spike, get that prototype out. Okay. So the problem I see in a lot of projects is we start with very limited information. We don't know what we're going to discover. And then as the project goes along, we start finding out more and more. And of course, we find out the most just as we're trying to ship it, or even in production if we're unlucky. And even on the agile projects, most of us are still in places in enterprises where governance and compliance requires you to do a certain amount of analysis. And that's when the budget is made. That's when the commitments around this is the scope get made. Right back here. This is why small releases are so, so valuable. Because then you find this out in a small way while you've still got some time, still got some budget to react to it. So if you're on one of those projects, see if you can find something tiny that you could do that will get you some information about whether what you're doing is the right thing. If you can get it to production, fantastic, but even if you can't, show it to people, see if you can get some feedback. What we're aiming to do is to keep our options open. There's a couple of other models that I wanted to share with you, deliberate discovery and real options. These are great ways I found of thinking about what we can do. So a probe is a way of deliberately discovering the information, a spike or prototype is a way of deliberately discovering the information we need to make the right decisions while it's still early, before we've made a commitment. And this is a model that Dan North, who's the guy who created BDD, came up with. He said, what you've got to do, 3 rules. First rule, assume that there's ignorance. Assume there's stuff you don't know. Second rule, assume second-order ignorance. This is the stuff you don't know you don't know. It's the complex stuff, the high discovery stuff. And he says, optimize for discovery. I did a little thought experiment once. A guy called Cedar Adrovo taught it to me. It was passed by a guy called Ashley Johnson from Gemba. He said, think of a project you've been on. How long did it take? 9 months, a year. And pretty typically I ask people, how long would it take to do the same project again with the same people, same technology, same requirements, just again? And usually it's about half the time. That's how much time is spent learning. In software development, learning is your constraint. The quicker you can make these discoveries, the faster you will go. The opposite side of the coin is real options, and this was created by a guy called Chris Matz, who has a financial background. And he said, in finance, an option, it's right but not the obligation to get something or to do something. We can price them up in finance, it's harder in real life. But having options, having places you can go to, having different things you could try, still has value. We know that's true. And the more uncertainty there is, the more value you have. At some point, you have to make the choices, or they make it for you. And never commit early unless you know why. So I know a lot of us who work in Agile, we're familiar with the concept of the last responsible moment. You can actually pay to extend your options. So I wanted to tell a very quick story just to illustrate this. There was a conference in the States, a big lean Kanban conference run by David J. Anderson, and he has this thing called a Brickle Key Award. And every year they give it to 2 winners from a shortlist of 6. And they announce the shortlist, and then they have to vote on the winners. And the people who need to vote are people like David J. Anderson himself, Carl Scotland, who's a UK-based coach here, Don Reinertson, famous product guru, expensive, well-paid consultants who are scattered around the world. They tried to do it over Skype, over Hangouts, wouldn't work. Need to be in the same room for this vote to happen. The only day they could get these people together was on the Monday before the conference. Conference started on the Tuesday. The awards ceremony for giving out the trophy was on the Thursday, and the lead time for getting the crystal trophies engraved with the winner's name was 4 weeks. So they got 6 trophies made. It was a lot cheaper than flying people in just for the vote. There's a rumour that Chris Matz was running round the conference with one of the trophies they broke in the voting session as they eliminated people, going, anyone want to see what an expired option looks like? There's a great book, if anybody wants to know more about this real options way of thinking, keeping your options open. It's a graphic novel, which means it's a super, super easy read. You can read it in a couple of hours. So Chris Matz and Olaf Marston wrote it. Chris Geary is the artist. I actually crop up on page 76, so don't be surprised. Cool. All right. So this is another person who was pretty good at working with real options. This is Peter Polchinski. He had these principles for engineering that he tried to introduce to the Soviet government. And he said, seek out new ideas and try new things. It's really important to have that innovation. When you're trying something new, do it on a scale where failure will be survivable. So do it smaller, cheaper, faster. And seek out feedback and learn from your mistakes. Unfortunately for Peter Polchinski, he ranted about these principles to the Soviet government and the need for safety long enough they got fed up with him and had him executed. So he needs to learn a little bit, I think, from his own principles. He didn't survive it. The most important kind of safety turns out to be psychological. So the last thing I want to give to you is a couple of techniques for getting that psychological safety happening. Psychological safety, Google did a survey of all their teams. They called this project Aristotle, and they found that the #1 indicator of high-performing teams was this concept of psychological safety, a sense of confidence that the team won't embarrass or reject somebody for speaking up. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to get that. Who here does TDD? Who doesn't do TDD? You'll go learn TDD, okay? What do we do when we've got some new behaviour we want to introduce to an existing system? We write a failing test, right? This is the TDD cycle. And then when we've wrote the failing test, we write the code to make it pass. And then when we've written the code to make it pass, we refactor it. And then we do the next one. But what happens when we have a legacy system with no tests and there's behavior that we value in that system and we're about to change some of the other behavior? What do we do first? We put it under test, right? We put the behavior we're interested in, the behavior we want to anchor under test. And that's what you do with people too. So I'm going to give you some models of changing people's behavior. It's exactly like TDD. The first is porpoise feedback. If you do nothing else, anchor what you value about the people. Make sure that people know what you value about them. If you see somebody do some really great TDD, call it out. If you see somebody spike something that looks pretty awesome, if you see somebody creating a framework that's open source and you think it's a great framework, call it out, tweet about it. Say thank you to them. Ask them to present it somewhere else. Go pair with them, support them. When you've done that, you can do the sandwich model. Who's heard of the sandwich model? It's got another name. It's sometimes called the shit sandwich because people think it's, you've got to say something good, say something bad, say something good. That's not a great way to do it. I'm going to show you the good way to do it. First of all, anchor what you value. Then you can provide feedback to people to increase their effectiveness. Here's what I really value about this. Sometimes I say, I'm coming from a place of care. I want you to be successful, and this is why I'm telling this to you. End with where you want to get to. I'm really looking forward to being in this place. I really want to achieve this aim. I want you to have this beautiful thing. I want you to have this, be in this great place. Okay? There's a really interesting thing about this sandwich model. I mean, this is essentially TDD, right? We're writing the legacy test to pin down our legacy behavior, make sure we don't lose it. And then we're writing a failing test, ending with a bright future, saying, here's where I would like you to get to. You're not quite there yet. People write their own code. You don't need the bit in the middle. You can actually get changes in behavior by just anchoring what you value about people and describing where you want to get to. And I have had really great change, and people don't react to it with backfire. They don't feel emotionally challenged when all you're doing is supporting them and being excited about where you want to get to. Really simple. If you have anchored what you value, and if where you're trying to get to is known, and you have that rapport, you can do what we call the Atkins model of feedback, which is exactly like the sandwich model, but without the bread. Okay, just provide feedback to increase effectiveness, but you have to have that rapport to be able to do that. One of the things that we often do when we're talking through Cynefin, we're using Cynefin, is we look for stories. This is actually from a tool which collects stories from people, and people signify the stories. They have these little triads, and they say, is your story about the past, the present, and the future? And people will move their little triad. They did this in Singapore as an experiment, and they found that there was a big gap in the future. Nobody was telling stories about the future. And they found that nobody was saving for their pensions, nobody was buying houses, they're all renting, and there was going to be a problem 20 years down the line. And they were able to do some interventions which actually changed the stories and moved the stories to a better place. So you can imagine this is kind of control, indifference, and vulnerability is another triad they have. And you might map a couple of these things on this axis, and there's contour, which is just another one of these values. And they look for patterns in these stories. And you can listen to the stories in your organisation as well. You don't need one of these tools. The thing is that when you try and move the stories, if you try and move them, if we decide that up there is better, we want to be in this place, and we're down in this place, and people are down here. If you try and move to this empty area here, this is a sign that there's no support for the stories in whatever organisation, whatever system that is, right? There's no support for stories there. You can move to where you see other stories happening. There's support there, so it's got what we call disposition. Somebody once asked me about that, and they said, I don't understand complex versus complicated. I said, well, is a football game complex or complicated? They said, well, it depends. I said, is it predictable or not? They said, well, is England playing? I said, look, just because England are disposed to lose doesn't mean they always will. So that's disposition. It's what we have in complexity rather than predictability. But when you're listening to the stories, you can hear where there's disposition. People are already trying things out in your organisation. They're already doing things. They've already got these probes working. They're already, trying this framework, getting Git instead of Subversion happening. When you see that, support them. Anchor those things that you value and amplify them. That's the single simplest thing you can do as leaders. Help your peers out. amplify those existing probes, those other stories. And the weird thing is that when people see change happening, when people see that change is supported, they're more likely to try it out. They start feeling psychologically safe. I have got more change happening as a coach just by saying, that's awesome. Can you do it more over here? Can you go talk to those people? Can you do a presentation? Than anything else. Amplifying the existing stuff. That relentless positivity is at the heart of everything I do as a consultant. It results in me being quite kind to people, but I'm not a fluffy person. I care about delivery. So I'm not telling you these things to get you to be fluffy. I'm telling you these things to help you be really effective and to help you become leaders, even in your own space. One of the things that I realized is that when I ask for feedback, I often try and get that improving feedback, and we're not gentle enough with ourselves. A lot of us have imposter syndrome. A lot of us are cruel to ourselves when we see everything we do wrong. Notice the things that you do right as well and amplify those. And you'll put yourselves in a better position for helping other people. Thank you very much.